Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the newest episode of Inflection Point Podcast. I'm your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hi, I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome.
Excellent, excellent. So we have an incredible team today. We have 2 guests that are featured with us. If you've been following us, you know that we've done multiple parts on this particular topic, fighting for freedom denied. So this is actually the 3rd and final part of that particular topic. And the Navy in black and white is sort of our subtopic, if you will. And the question of the hour is, how do 2 retired naval officers, one on a flat career track, the other on an obstacle course, come together in the wake of the George Floyd murder? So there's a lot of information that's going to be packed in. So I'm just going to get right to it and introduce our 2 guests. So the first one is Reuben Keith Green. He's a retired Surface Warfare U.S. Naval Officer who served 22 years in the Atlantic Fleet. He has devoted his energy to discussing issues regarding military service that adversely affect minority personnel and has written or been featured in multiple stories that address those issues. He has an MS degree in human resources development. He's the author of Black Officer, White Navy, which chronicles his voyage from a high school dropout to Surface Warfare Officer. Then we have Dr. John Cordle, a retired Navy captain with 30 years of service. He commanded 2 warships, the USS Oscar Austin DDG-79 and the USS San Jacinto CG-56. I have no idea what those numbers mean, so just bear with me.
I can explain it.
He was the 2010 recipient of the Navy League John Paul Jones Award, the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery Epictetus Award for Innovative and Inspirational Leadership, and the 2019 American Society of Naval Engineers Solberg Award Winner for his research in the area of crew endurance and human systems engineering. So we have 2 power-packed guests, and we're going to tell you a tale of 2 officers. So what I'd like to do is start with the backstory of how you each ended up in the Navy, and we'll start with Reuben.
Good afternoon. My father was in the Navy. I grew up in Navy towns, Newport, Rhode Island, San Diego, and Norfolk, Virginia. I lived in all of those, plus, places I lived when my father was out at sea. But I wanted to join the Navy because I asked my parents to buy me encyclopedias when I was a kid. I was always drawn to the pictures of the naval officers in the encyclopedias, those snazzy uniforms, and they're standing up on the mast holding on, talking about damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and all that stuff. I wanted to be that guy. I wanted to command my own ship. So, and then I read a lot when I was a kid. So I was reading about what was happening in the Navy and in the armed forces, the Vietnam era. And so I just wanted to join the Navy. My father had been in the Navy and in the Army, and he just adamantly refused for me to join the Navy because he said the Navy was too racist. I decided that Admiral Zumwalt was right and my father was wrong. What did my father know? He only spent, 15, 16 years in the Navy. What did he know? So I decided to join, talked to my mother and my stepmother into signing the papers, and off I went to boot camp in Orlando, Florida in 1975.
So, John, can you tell us your backstory of how you ended up in the Navy?
Sure. It wasn't quite so focused as Keith. My dad was what we call a Mustang in the Navy, so he was enlisted, came in World War II as a seaman, and rose to the rank of lieutenant commander. And so when you shift to officer, they call you a Mustang. That's kind of a Navy term. And so I was sort of in the Navy as a Navy brat, moving all over the place until I was 12, and then he retired to Rome, Georgia, where I went to elementary and high school, and then. I had really good grades, went to a private school. You talked about a flat track. I pretty much, middle class white military family, went to a private school and had no idea what I wanted to do. I was in a rock band. I had straight A's, and I was splitting the difference between school and playing, Southern rock. And about my 18th birthday, my dad said, "Son, you graduate from high school in 3 months, and here's the deal: you ain't living here. I ain't paying for college. And so here's an application to the Naval Academy." And I said, "What's the Naval Academy?" And he goes, "Well, it's where you go to college for free." And I said, "Okay." So I filled out one for the Naval Academy, never been there, never researched it. All my friends were going to Georgia Tech, so I filled out a scholarship to that. I got accepted for both, had to interview and stuff. And basically I decided that I wanted to take the more difficult path and the one that would get me out of Georgia. And so I went to the Naval Academy. I got there 3 days into what they call plebe summer, which is boot camp basically for the officers. I went down and called my dad, and I said, he's a 30-year Mustang, retired. And I said, "Dad, I don't think I can handle this." He's like, "This is not what I expected, and I think I want to come home." And he goes, "You're an adult, make a decision." And I'm like, "Oh crap, I thought you were going to give me some sage advice." And I said, "Well, I can't let him down." And so I stayed. And that resulted in 30 years. So that was my story.
Excellent. So when we did our meet and greet, one of the things, John, that you pointed out is that you both had the experience of being in the Navy, but between the two of you, the experience was strikingly different and you didn't know each other. So can you share how the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement brought the two of you together?
Sure. I'll start, and then I think Keith has some pieces of the puzzle. But I've been fairly active on LinkedIn for a couple of years. I've written a lot in Proceedings Magazine, which is the Naval Institute, and it's a good forum to share with a professional network. And so I was kind of active on LinkedIn. Got intrigued by some of the activities there around the George Floyd murder, and then Ahmaud Arbery, who's also in Georgia, my home state, certainly got my attention. And we'll come back to that one, I think, later between the two of us. But I just happened to, as I was reading some of Keith's posts, it kind of caught my eye, and about how articulate he was and how he posted things that made people uncomfortable. And then I watched somebody post something that was borderline racist, basically calling him out for being, playing the victim card, I think was the words used, and which I thought was unprofessional. So number one, I blocked the person who made that comment, but I made a point to tell him why I was blocking him. And that, I saw the like thing button go off from Keith, and then we connected, and then we got to talking, and then he sent me his book, Black Officer, White Navy. And once I read that, it sort of pushed me over the edge and made me really think about stuff I never thought about before.
Excellent, excellent. So Keith, did you have any, see, I done called you and switch from Reuben to Keith. So can you just add to some of what John just described in terms of how that incident brought you together, the murder of George Floyd?
Well, I post a lot of stuff on LinkedIn about issues that pertain to mistreatment or abuse of Black people. And I try to give them the perspective of someone who was a fine, upstanding citizen, never had any trouble with the law, served my country, and demonstrate that I too also had some of those similar issues. And I still get a lot of pushback on that. I'm called a racist about once a week, but it was unusual for me to have someone come to my defense like that. And I knew who John was years before we ever connected, because I'd been following his writing in preceding magazines, for years. So once we connected, I saw that he was very receptive to information that he had not been aware of in the past. So I sent him the book, and I was surprised when he contacted me and said, "Hey, I just read all this stuff about John C. Stennis. I never knew any of this." He says, "You need to write an article about this." So thanks to John, I got that article published. And I mean, it's just been, full speed ahead ever since. We have this synergy because John is very receptive to information that he was not previously aware of. And I can just give him something to think about. I typically will tell him, "Well, have you read this? Have you thought about that?" And once I do that, he's off and running. So it's really been a godsend to me, because he can address issues in a way that I can't. Because being a Black man, a lot of times you're viewed with hostility when you talk about these things. And a white guy from Georgia, he's just curious.
Excellent, excellent, because we get that a lot. This whole idea of, as a matter of fact, in the work that I do, the anti-racism activation work that I do, that's one of the central things that I point out to people, is that you don't know what you don't know. Until you get to that point where you're actually able to step into that discomfort, if you will, of having conversations with people who have lived experiences, historical knowledge, and things like that about things that you're not even aware of, that's not even on your radar screen. And so when you meet somebody who looks like John, and they're open to that, they're receptive to that, that is such a great inspiration, almost, if you will, to know that there certainly are people out there who are willing to step into this space with some truth, and particularly with the idea of getting to the point of healing. So Mavis and Gail, you have any comments on that?
Go ahead.
I just love the miracle of the connection. Did you Keith Reuben and Reuben Keith and John, did you just hit it off immediately, or did you ever have any time where you were not communicating very well? Did you just kind of connect and were able to hear each other? Who wants to answer that one?
I'll go first.
I'll take a stab. Okay, go ahead.
John initially had a little trouble figuring out my sense of humor. I can be pretty dry sometimes. And, an old Black man with a sense of humor that's dry can be a little bit hard to figure out sometimes. I think he's got it now. And but we didn't really have any issues. It's just that I think it took a while for him to get a hold of because I tease him all the time now. But before, I could tell he wasn't sure whether I was being serious or kidding. So, but no, we hit it off immediately. I knew, as I said, I'd been following his writing for years, and I knew who he was, and I knew the kind of person that he was. So I wasn't surprised that we hit it off.
Excellent, excellent. So Reuben, your book, Black Officer, White Navy, has the subtitle Thriving While Black and Sailing Second Class in the Post-Zimwalt Navy. So for this part of the conversation, can we explore what is the significance of that one Navy ideal of Chief Naval Officer Zimwalt? And you mentioned that on the back cover, and then you talk about this whole thing with this post-Zimwalt Navy and how it differed from the one Navy ideal. So can you give us, our audience, a little bit of background or history, if you will, in terms of who that admiral was and what this one Navy ideal thing was all about?
Well, Admiral Zumwalt was the youngest CNO ever at the time he was selected. He was deep selected over about 30 senior admirals. And he was replacing a guy named Admiral Thomas Maurer, who went on to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Maurer was a racist from Alabama, and he wanted nothing to do with Zumwalt. He didn't like Zumwalt, and he sent him off to Vietnam to be in charge of the Brown Water Navy over there. Zumwalt excelled, and he had caught the attention of several politicians, and he wound up getting deep selected to become the youngest CNO ever. And it was mainly because of all the problems that the Navy was having during that time. It wasn't just racism, it was also people being overworked. There was sabotage, there was lots of drug use. The Navy was trying to be dragged into the 20th century, and they thought that Zumwalt might be the person to do that. So Admiral Zumwalt was the reason I joined the Navy. So when he became the CNO, he really wasn't all that attuned. He was like John. He was kind of oblivious to how bad it was for minority sailors. And there was an officer named Lieutenant Commander William Norman. And I think he was a lieutenant at the time. He was an aviator. And he wrote a resignation letter that was fairly scathing. And someone in the Bureau of Naval Personnel showed it to Zumwalt. And Zumwalt said, I want to talk to this guy. Have him come see me. And Norman didn't want to see him. But they've convinced him to go see Zumwalt. And Norman showed up with a list of demands because Zumwalt wanted him to come work for him. He said, don't leave, stay and help me fix these problems. So Norman gave Zumwalt this list of 20 things. I think it was 20 things that he said needed to be done. And Zumwalt signed off on all of them immediately. One of the first things he did was made it possible for Filipino sailors to go and strike for any rate they wanted to, rather than just be a steward and officer servant. So that was a huge change that happened right off the bat. And the other thing that Norman did was he would have lunch with Zumwalt once a week, and he would school Zumwalt. He gradually began to educate him on what it was like for Blacks in the Navy and Blacks dependents in the military. And much of that stuff was traumatic to Zumwalt. He had no idea. He traveled around the fleet, talked to dependents, talked to sailors, talked to officers, and he was just shocked at some of the things he didn't learn. So he began to make all these changes, and there was a tremendous amount of pushback, such as you saw with the anti-extremist training in the military recently. Tremendous amount of pushback from the old guard who wants to maintain the status quo, and we're still fighting that today.
Right. I think
John, if you could comment on that as well.
Right. So that was a little bit, my dad retired kind of in the beginning of the Zumwalt era. My dad was in Vietnam for 2 years before really the Navy was that involved over there, but I never really spoke much about it. But, one of the things Admiral Zumwalt did, he invented this thing called a Z-gram, right? Z for Zumwalt and like a telegram. So whereas normally Navy policy is done by an instruction that's built by a staff, it takes months or a year to build out and then promulgate. He would have a meeting with his staff, and then he would write this down, and the next day he would change a major policy, like integrating the Filipino stewards, which have been in place for decades, and it really pushed people back the wrong way, because they're like, well, who is he? Who's this upstart CNO to tell us how to do business? And so people tried to wait him out, they tried to push him out, but he just kept going. And I think a year after those, Keith will correct me here, but he called everybody together and basically said, look, you folks are not getting it, and so he gave them a year, and then he called them on the carpet, because he said, this is not a vote, right? We're going to change these things. And I think it's worth pointing out that, now if there's racist or discriminatory policies in the Navy, they're a little more subtle than back then. Back then, there were literally roadblocks. Women in the Navy, were even when they were allowed in, could not serve on combat ships, could not fly combat aircraft. So there were stark lines. Now it's a little more blurred sometimes. But I think that's maybe one change over the years.
So how successful was Admiral I want to make sure I get this right, Chief Naval Officer Zumwalt? How successful overall was that? Because when you look at the Navy now, there are still problems. Like when I went on the Progressive Magazine website, and I saw multiple instances from, as close to our time as 2021, where it seems like these issues were still there. So was the One Navy successful? And then when Admiral Zumwalt moved on, things started to kind of shift back to normal. So can you talk a little bit about that aspect of it all?
I'll take a shot. Since I retired in 2013 and stayed close to the Navy and work for the Navy now, probably should disclaim that these are my views and not Department of Defense. But So I think, I always say the Navy's a big ship with a small rudder, right? You have to push
Mm-hmm.
really, really hard to get it to turn. And then once it turns, it'll go. But the forces of nature try to center it back up. And so I think you did see some of that. But I do think that it has come a long way since then. The other thing is, don't forget that who's in the Navy? It's people from society. And so the Navy would be completely, unbiased and racist free if we didn't bring in people from the outside world who have whatever bias. I tell people, I was thinking through this the other day, I pulled up a high school yearbook. 112 people in my graduating class and 400 people in the school. I think one Black person, 2 Asian people. I just didn't have a diverse people to talk to growing up. And then I went to the Naval Academy. Even in the 80s, it wasn't very diverse. I think there were, just had the first class with women. In my 120 person company, there were no African Americans. So, it's tough to overcome those boundaries if you just never see them. You never come up against them. Does that make sense?
That's
Yeah,
my
yeah.
background too.
Right.
That's my background.
And
I
look at
just-
us now.
And look at it. I just wanted to interject that I was impressed with Zumwalt saying, or that he recognized discrimination. I think you had this in your book, Keith, recognized discrimination as a threat to national security.
Mhm.
I mean, that's big.
Absolutely.
Do I remember that correctly? So if people can't work together for reasons of racial tension, then what have we got? Yeah, do you want to
And
speak to
you
that?
experienced some of those according to your book. You experienced some of those. Yeah.
I had multiple instances where the mission of my organization was being threatened because someone was trying to harm me and keep me from being successful. And that was more important to them than working together to, further the mission of the ship. The primary example I use is I was a brand new department head on a ship out of Mayport, Florida. I was the only Black officer on the ship. I was in charge of the engineering department, and I was the junior department head in the entire Atlantic fleet. I skipped a second division officer tour and shore duty and went directly to department head school. I was one of 2 lieutenant junior grades there when that happened, and the other was senior to me. But to make a long story short, when I reported to that ship, it was like walking into a buzzsaw. I had a mostly white engineering department. I was not a career engineer. So it was just a cauldron of hostility. And I had my own subordinates were trying to undermine me, being disrespectful publicly. And I had a supply officer. 1 month before my ship deployed, I had a major explosion and a fire in my engine room. And there was $1 million worth of damage that I had to fix and also continue making repairs to get underway. So my supply officer was brand new. He was from Texas, and so was my skipper. He was intentionally denying me the parts I needed to get my ship underway and to make repairs. And I couldn't get anyone to help me. I talked to the CO, the XO, the other department heads. I knew the supply regulations backwards. And I finally, in frustration one night, in desperation, I sat up one night and created a spreadsheet which listed my 25 most critical parts. And I showed what was happening. I had to pull out information from different parts in the supply system. It took me all night long. I was up all night. So when the captain came in, I showed him what was happening. And I explained to him, I have been asking you for help, and you've been telling me to work it out with the supply officer. This is what he's doing to me. If you don't help me, this ship will not deploy on time. If this ship doesn't deploy on time, that's going to impact national security. You're going to have to explain that to someone, and you're not going to be able to blame me because I've been telling you for weeks now that I need help and you won't help. So I'm just telling you, my next step was to march over to the squadron and hand them that spreadsheet and say, look, I can't get my skipper to understand how this racism I'm experiencing is impacting this ship. If you want the Commodore to have to explain it to somebody, that's going to be your business. Fortunately, the captain read that report and was shocked. I think he just assumed I was whining, just a crybaby. But once he saw it with his own eyes and understood it, he called the supply officer up there. He couldn't explain it. He'd never seen that report before. And he liked that report so much. Well, first of all, he ordered all those parts ordered that day. So I got my parts immediately, but I had to fill out casualty reports. I was up again all night doing all these casualty reports that I could not do until the parts had been, approved. So the captain liked that report so much that he had the other department heads learn from me how to do that report. So now all of us are doing additional work 1 month before deployment. Well, guess who they're all mad at? They're all mad at me, but none of them were willing to come forward and say, hey, Keith is having a problem here. None of us is having a problem. Maybe this is a racial issue. So that's one example. I had another one years later where another warrant officer was dragging his feet on building a mobile wet trainer that I commissioned with my own people, because the one that we had that was so expensive that was traveling around the East Coast got canceled due to lack of funding. So we decided to build our own. That warrant officer was dragging his feet, enjoying messing with me, having me come to his office and question him, and he'd lie to me and say they were going to work on it. And finally, I went over there after he canceled it, giving me assurances he was going to fix it. And I went and chewed him out using some sailor language publicly. And then I followed him to his boss's office. And then I chewed his boss out using some more sailor language. And I was expecting to be court-martialed, but I'd had it with these people. And they were making me look bad in front of my boss. And I didn't tell my boss what was happening. I just figured I could grit my teeth and bear it out. So that turned into a big fight between two crusty Navy captains. And it wound up, I was left on the floor to explain what happened. Once I did, and that crusty old Navy captain saw what his own people were doing, he put them to work around the clock for 3 days over holiday weekend to get that war wagon finished up. Now, once that was finished, all the sailors on the waterfront could come and do training on damage control and whatnot without trashing their ship, setting fires, or having electrical issues. And they got written up in Surface Warfare magazine about what a great self-help project this was and how innovative it was, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they interviewed the crusty old captain that wanted to be court-martialed. They interviewed my boss, but guess who was left out of that story?
Oh, amazing.
Of course.
Yeah, so we have about 30 more seconds before we're gonna take our first break. So is there anything final that you would like to say about all of that, Keith?
I'd like to pass it to John.
Okay, well, you know what? Since we are so close to break time, let's just take a break now, and then we'll come back and we'll resume the conversation. And I believe Gail is going to lead us in part of the next conversation as well. So welcome back. You are listening to Inflection Point podcast on Transformation Talk Radio. And our topic is Fighting for Freedom Denied, Part 3, the Navy in Black and White. And I'm going to pass the baton to Gail to lead this next portion of the conversation.
Okay, so the question is, why is it important for your voices to be heard in unison? But John, you recommended that we read one of your articles from Proceedings Magazine, the publication of the U.S. Naval Institute. The article is titled "The Case for Renaming the USS John C. Stennis," which is a reference to a naval ship. And the article was written by both of you and connects back to the One Navy concept that Admiral Zumwalt actually originated. And I don't know if everybody knows who John C. Stennis was, but he was an extremely racist senator, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah,
And
so
named after him, yes.
right. So as you mentioned, in Keith's book, there was a mention of in the Navy, there are ship naming conventions that are not so much laid down in law or some guidelines, but they're kind of traditional. And in the past, we've named aircraft carriers after presidents, USS Kennedy,
Right.
Washington, Lincoln. But we've also named some after senators who were very good to the Navy. And Senator Stennis and Carl Vinson are two. They got carriers named after them because of their stewardship for the Navy over the years. And so that's great, right? But when you dig into it, you look at what they did when they were younger, and actually carried on through their lives. And so I just took, I took the, Keith always talks about my studiousness. Well, I always start with Wikipedia, right? So I just type in John C. Stennis on Wikipedia. And the first thing that comes up is a segregational senator from, and part of the Southern Democrats, I think they were called, who one of their main purposes in life was to perpetuate discrimination and sort of the Jim Crow laws and policies that separated blacks and whites. And so I made a joke to Keith. I sent him a note that said, okay, is a segregationalist a racist? And in his typical way, he came back and said, think about the question that you just asked me. And what do you think I'm going to say? Um, and so you don't have to read till the next line in Wikipedia where the answer is yes, right? I mean,
Yes.
you don't segregate by race without being racist.
That's
And
right.
yet we never call him a racist. We call him a segregationalist
Yeah.
because it sounds better. And there's even been an article by a Black commanding officer of that ship and an admiral who commanded a battle group from that ship. So there's been a lot of advocacy to change the name. And so some people say, well, and a lot of people say, mainly, people of my demographic say, hey, that's history, right? We're not going to change history, and we shouldn't. That's over the top. I've been asked, where's the bar, right? Washington owned slaves, so he can't have a carrier named after him. I said, well, okay, there's a balance there, right? Washington was the father of our country, and it was a different time. So maybe there's a sliding scale somewhere. But imagine the symbology. Back to Keith's point of hey, let's make a statement, right? We talked about adding. The Navy has core values of honor, courage, and commitment. We're going to talk in a minute about Task Force One Navy, which looked into things that we could do to acknowledge the differences and some of the challenges that we're having with disrespect. Because if I'm going to harass you, I clearly don't respect you, right? And so we wrote those articles, and they got shared all over the place. But then it's been a year and nothing has happened. There's been commissions looking at it, and I'm sure there's a political aspect to it. But at the end of the day, Keith's great question that he asked about all this is, what's the counterpoint? What's the counter argument? If the argument is he was a segregationalist, if that's not the thing you want to portray for our country going forward, not changing the status quo, as you mentioned, is really not a compelling argument. But that's why we wrote the article, and lots of people came back and said, "Wow, I never knew that."
Right.
So that was the story there, and that's an example, I think, where the two of us have either egged each other on, or I think Keith had some articles turned down by proceedings because they were sort of too inflammatory, and so he was sort of written off until I came in and opened the door. And so that way we've both been able to maybe knock down some barriers for the other that we haven't been able to, by ourselves.
Do you feel then that your voices together and the articles that you've written have made more of an impact, got more attention, got people to start thinking and looking within?
I think so. I think, we haven't seen there's 4 or 5 articles that we've written, and as Keith will back up, where the outcome of real change would be a tangible, adding a word to the core values, changing the name of an aircraft carrier, changing the Navy grooming policy, which has been shown to be discriminatory against African American sailors, right? None of those policies have changed, right? However, they're being talked about by a lot of senior people in ways that they were never talked about before. My command held a diversity and inclusion symposium, and allowed me to brief these things, to flag officers in public, which is pretty cool. Hadn't changed anything yet, but if there's one thing, I made a comment to Keith the other day that man, it just gets old saying the same thing over and over, and nobody listens to you. And his face kind of fell, and he kind of went, "Really?"
There's that humor.
Sounds like your life, Pete, right? I've been doing that my whole life, huh?
He's like, "Welcome to my world,"
Right.
because I've been at this for a year and a half. He's been at it for, I don't know, 80, 90 years ish.
Exactly.
Right,
That is
exactly.
such an incredible point that you're bringing up, because I think that's one of when people say, "Oh, well, that happened a long time ago," and I understand where they're coming from, but at the same time, the damage is still here. Like, people are still hurting. You have people that are still alive in the United States that survived Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right. That's right.
And so these things they're in the past, admittedly,
Present.
but they're still very present. And I think where we are now is just kind of in this place where, like, we're in a space where we could really make some changes here. And it's going to take the unison of multiple voices coming from multiple perspectives in order to make that happen. So, Reuben, if you could comment on some of this as well.
Well, the important thing to remember is that no change takes place until people are willing to hear what you have to say.
Mhm.
They may resist it, they may resent it, they may push back against it, but the important thing is that they hear you. And where the relationship I have with John comes in is that they're much more amenable to hearing him than hearing me, because I'm this big black guy with a deep voice and I just don't pull any punches or cut any corners with what I'm trying to say. I have to be very careful because I get called a racist and I get called, un-American and all these other things. But I'm just telling the truth as I see it. And I challenge people to tell me where I'm wrong. John does the same thing. And he gets a lot of pushback because he's helping to advocate for some of the ideas that he has. And the advantage that he has that other people don't have is he's actually done the research. If I can just get people to think about these things that are happening, for instance, racism in the military. You have had multiple reports about people saying that they're facing racism in the military. And the immediate pushback is, well, I never saw any of that when I was in the service. And that's not as bad as it was, et cetera, et cetera. But that is discounting the experiences of people that reach out to me almost every day.
Right.
And I
that's
just,
coming from white people, right?
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like
and
I've never experienced sexism,
Right.
so there
right.
must be none,
Right.
right?
Must not exist at all. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
Right. But for you,
Mhm.
Keith, you even went to all those extent to be able to express what was really going on, to put it in writing in detail, and still the commander heard, but the last part of your book, when you talked about what happened before you retired, they heard him and they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't act on it.
And I think
Well,
it's also being mindful of the fact that so much of this is tied into white identity. And when you start introducing these topics and these experiences and everything that, I mean, if you think about in Florida, like, we don't want you to say anything that's going to make another person feel uncomfortable, that's going to make a white person feel uncomfortable. But at the same time, the very history has been about my uncomfort, my ancestors, my uncomfort and everything. And so again, even when you're talking about comfort, white comfort is sort of put on a higher pedestal, if you will, than the discomfort of all the violence that has been perpetrated against a people. And it's because part of it is so much tied up in white identity.
Well, we talked about Wikipedia. So the other day, I'm not going to go down this road, but in the Navy we have Black History Month, Hispanic History Month, and one of my friends made a joke. Well, actually, he said, "Well, I feel discriminated against because I don't see a White History Month, right?" And so I started to say, well, what would that look like? And you can imagine where that discussion went. And
Wow.
Keith said he would disown me if I went down that path. But if you look it up in Wikipedia, the word white as a discriminator didn't exist until like 100 years ago, and it was really put there to separate the whites from the slaves, right? The owners from the slaves, and then white can mean, even when we look now, heck, I was in I filled out a form the other day, and I didn't know what to click because there were so many choices about what my race was, and then I saw a great post the other day that we're all, race is really a misnomer, right? It's the human race, and we're the only animal that differentiates between what color we are. So it's such a trivial thing. It's kind of like this discussion about facial hair, right? The military is so hung up on clean shaven faces, and we have proof, right, that African Americans who have this condition that causes them to not shave get promoted behind their peers. Everyone with a beard does, right? And so Keith's question, another great question was, what if this affliction was one of white people? Darn well that policy would have been changed a long time ago, right? And so to go back and look at it from the other side, I'm sure you're going to bring this up, and your comment the other day about the two sides of a coin, and how when you're looking at one side, you can't physically see the other side. Really resonated with me, because that's where I think a lot of my friends come from is, hey, I've spent my whole life looking at this side of the coin, and I like this side of the coin. Don't make me look at the other side, right?
Well,
And
any kind of change or transformation requires us to look within ourselves, right? We
Right.
have to get off
Right.
that side of the coin and get on that
Yeah.
edge in order to be able to see, wow, it's not just me here, right? There's a whole different perspective that we need to
Right.
take a look at. And we need to start
Exactly.
listening to, as you said before, and really start hearing what the truth is. You know, as you were saying, Keith, before, it's really about the truth. And it's white people have a very hard time seeing that truth and having the
Right.
conversations around, and that's exactly what we have to have.
And I want to be careful not to lump, there's a book out there called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. It was
Right.
on the Chief of Naval Operations reading list, and then he got beat up by Congress for putting this anti-American book on there. And then he defended it to his credit. And then he quietly removed it. So I went back and read it, and it talks about one of the things that he talks about is, hey, let's don't lump anybody together. White people, black people, Hispanic. They're not monolithic. There's a broad spectrum
Right.
of beliefs and everything across the board. So I think that's one of the things that people react to is when, if I say black people or Keith says white people, there's a them
Right,
inference
right.
to that discussion. And I think we have, whenever you use the word them or they, you immediately put up a barrier.
Exactly.
And so you really have to say we. The best discussions I've had is with a very junior, African American or Hispanic or female sailor, where I just ask them, what barriers have you had to knock down? And whether it's to make fun of my accent, body shaming on the internet, the stuff again that I never had to deal with, or if I did, I was oblivious to it. And so I think more important than research is listen, right? Is just sit down, shut up, and let somebody else tell their story.
And we really have to listen and hear, not from what is going on in my mind that I want to say back to you, but really hear from the
Right.
perspective of the person we're listening
Right.
to really hear them. And
Yeah.
that is
And
exactly what needs to
it's
happen.
about listening with the intention
Yeah.
of understanding. Like I want to understand. Like I've been living on this side of the coin my whole entire life. All I can see is what's in front of me. All I can see is what is there.
Help
And
me
if
know
I'm
what
going
you
to
see.
make that, if I'm going to make that leap
Yeah.
and to be able to step on that other side of the coin, I'm going to need some guidance for people to tell me what those experiences like or like, what are those historical moments and everything. But if I'm going to ask that question and I'm going to walk in that space, I have to be able to listen. And you
Right.
have to be willing to take your own, to a certain extent, I talk about this all the time, your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs. You have to examine those and be willing to put them aside to be able to understand somebody else has a completely different experience in life
Right.
than I do. So even if you take the black, white, take all of that
Right.
away and just look at this person's experience in life is completely different from my own, which is part of what you talked about, Keith, when you met Reuben and your all's relationship began to flourish and you began to see everything that he's describing. I cannot claim that I've had any of those experiences.
So Keith, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you asked us to read the 3 chapters, the 8, 9, 12 in your book, right? And I did, and in fact, a few more. What was it that can you say, I think I know why you wanted us to read it, but can you share with us what that was about for you that you wanted us to read it?
I wanted you to be able to immerse yourself in trying to do a good job and being thwarted at every turn, being humiliated, being embarrassed, being ridiculed, being denied resources. Those 3 chapters dealt with resource denial, which is one of the things that is a common theme for Black people to experience. It doesn't matter what field of endeavor you're in. If you're starved of the resources you need to do your job, then you're going to suffer. And if you thrive in spite of that thriving, it makes people angry. And in chapter 12, I was completely hamstrung. I was running 2 departments. I was in charge of the telephone office, but the comptroller would not give me a government telephone, because I would order one and he would give it to somebody else. That was an intentional denial of resources. So I'm spending my own money out of my own pocket to run 2 departments while he is not doing his job. And then I had to step in and do work that he was supposed to do. And then once I finished that, my boss wants to give credit to someone else for the work that I had just done. And then when I challenged him on that, he said the work was unsatisfactory. So at that point, I had just about had it. I'm about ready to
Wow,
snatch
yeah.
him up from behind his desk and throw him through that plate glass window. So I decided at that point I was going to test the system. This is what's happening to me. I have all this documentation, pages and pages, 50 something
Good.
enclosure that will document everything that's been happening to me. And when I decided to trust the system for myself, I fell flat on my face. The system rallied around him, protected him because they didn't want the Navy to look bad. I was expendable, even though I was the one that was
Doing
100%
the work.
right.
Exactly, yeah.
So
Right.
I'm not the only one that's experienced that. I get calls from people and talk to people all the time that are having similar experiences. But when you point that out and you try to use the system that has been in place for decades to report these issues and to get justice or just get relief, you become the problem and then you get targeted for removal. So if the system that's designed to protect you ultimately will punish you and hurt you, then the system is really just a fraud.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I was
Just
in agreement. Yeah.
yeah. So I was talking with a young African American chief petty officer about this facial policy, and he had suffered quite a bit of insult and lost some orders over it because you couldn't be in a particular high visibility position with a beard, even though he had to have a beard because of his skin condition. And I said, well, why don't you speak up a little bit more? And he goes, sir, I have a family. He goes, when you're being discriminated against, it's not in your best interest to point that out. And so, in the one article that Keith helped me with about respect, there's 2 DoD studies in the past year, 2021, that said that 33% of minorities have reported discrimination in the workplace, in the military, and 24% of women have reported harassment. And so, I think there's a case to be made that if you're prejudiced in one area, you're probably prejudiced in others. And so an ism is an ism. If you're on the end of harassment, it doesn't matter whether it's because you're black or female or gay or whatever. But think about that: 1 in 3 of our African American, back to his national security issue, a teamwork issue. If I'm on a hose team with 24 people, 6 of them have been harassed by someone else on my ship. If my daughter's in the Navy, I saw a flag officer ask, would you tell your daughter to join the Navy? And they hesitate. Well, if I thought my daughter had a 25% chance of being harassed this year, now I don't know what those numbers are on the outside. They're probably similar. But still,
Well, and those
1
numbers
in
are probably
4
actually
sounds
low.
different,
Those numbers are
Okay.
probably actually
Well,
lower
so
than what they
I'm
really
sorry.
are.
Great point. So there were 2 other
Yeah.
points at the end of these studies. One was that these numbers are felt to be drastically undercounting
Right.
because of underreporting. And to Keith's point, why are they underreported? Because people don't trust the system.
Right.
And so now the SecNav has taken some pretty good steps in sexual harassment of late. He has removed the chain of command from the investigation process. So if there's a harassment complaint, it goes to an outside the command to get that influence that Reuben Keith talked about. The other thing is, at least in the sexual harassment mode, a lot of times the victim has also done something wrong: underage drinking, stayed out past curfew, and in the past, if they reported that, they could be charged with whatever they were doing wrong, even though they were raped or sexually harassed. So now that's changed. That has been done away with, and
Good.
commanders are not allowed to charge, what they call sort of nuisance offenses or minor
Okay.
offenses for a victim who
Right.
reports a violent crime. But that was like this year that changed. And so how many, there's all kinds of circumstances that lead to, there's a whole spectrum of behavior, whether it's racism or sexism. So, but no, that's, so we're making some strides. We're making some progress there. But even that there's been pushback.
Yeah, John, I just want to interject here. Something you said earlier, that something about the obstacles becoming more subtle. And it echoed to me the way that, slavery was ended, and then black codes, and then black codes, and then Jim Crow, and things just mutate into a different form. So, Keith, would you like to comment on what you sense and what you see as real change? Is that happening in a way that really changes how we go forward?
One of the biggest changes is that people are now actively talking about these issues and stating unequivocally that these things will not be tolerated. And you can see evidence of that. There have been flag and general officers that have been relieved for making racist comments and racist behaviors. I defended a Marine Corps general who had used racist language when talking to some of his subordinates. And I said at the time, we don't have enough information to determine whether or not he was being malicious or racist or what. Let's wait and see what the context was before we condemn this man, because this might have been a teaching moment that he was trying to use. And a few months later, when I read the final report and saw what he had actually done, then I understood, yes, he was being racist, making you people comments and, talking about Black neighborhoods, et cetera, and crime and whatnot. And I understood exactly why his subordinates were offended. But people are so quick to jump to racism when in fact, we may just be talking about racial differences or racial issues. So I don't assume.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah.
So we are quickly running out of time. And I wanted Reuben and Keith, if there's any websites or anything like that you want to call out for our audience that they can go and visit, or even your LinkedIn, whatever, so that they can learn a little bit more about your experiences individually, but also your experiences together.
Well, if you Google Lieutenant Commander Reuben Keith Green or just Reuben Keith Green, there's a bunch of stuff that pops up, some other interviews I've done, some articles. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I make friends all the time.
Yeah, and enemies.
And enemies. So if you go on LinkedIn, if there's something that I try to share a lot of information about Black history and these issues. So LinkedIn is the best place to find.
All right, excellent. John, real quick.
LinkedIn and read his book.
Oh, okay. Excellent. So I just want to thank you, the both of you, for being here, for graciously coming on and sharing your life, sharing your story, sharing your experience together. And I'm just in awe. As I watched the two of you, we had the chance to kind of get to know you a little bit over the course of the last couple of weeks or so as we've been putting all of this together. So I just wanted to thank you. And I also wanted to thank our audience for joining us for Inflection Point podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday of the month at 3 p.m. Pacific time and 6 p.m. Eastern time. And I'll see you at the next episode. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.